If you follow horror movie news like I do, you may have noticed a common think piece topic that has spread in the past 2 or 3 years, the rise of the art house horror film and how the genre is finally becoming philosophical, culturally significant, and psychological. These think pieces juxtapose seemingly embarrassing 1970s and 1980s slasher movie tropes with the likes of The Witch, It Follows, and The Babadook. All fantastic movies, by the way, enough that I have covered them all on this channel. However, there are a few problems with some of the conclusions that these articles reach. First, horror movies have always been philosophical, culturally significant, and psychological. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is one of the earliest horror films to have survived to this day. It's an important work in German expressionism and gives a lot of insight into the German citizens' relationship with authority, especially military authority, following World War I. Nosferatu, released in 1922, tells us a lot about how fear of the outsiders, the other, was part of Germany's national conversation. The difference between horror in the latter 20th century and horror in the 21st century is more about accessibility. The smartest horror films are more easily found these days due to the way technology has progressed and the fact that the manner in which we watch movies has changed. We can also communicate about the genre, and all genres, more than before, and this has led to the sudden realization among think piece writers that horror movies can have deep psychological and philosophical roots. The truth is that for every movie like It Follows that challenges our relationships, there was a movie with some of the same connective tissue, like Possession in 1981. For every claustrophobic psychological horror like The Invitation, there was an earlier claustrophobic psychological horror like Alien in 1979. For every movie like Under the Skin that ponders both humanity and more explicitly femininity, there is an earlier movie with comparable themes like Carrie in 1976, and so forth and so on. Bear in mind, that does not diminish great 21st century horror movies, but it is important to understand that horror has always been the stuff of intellectuals as much as it has been the stuff of the grindhouse crowd. The other element that these think pieces get wrong is that only now are the tropes of the slasher genre being challenged. When non-horror fans think of horror, their imaginations usually turn towards iconic horror characters, Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, and Freddy Krueger, all three of them the antagonists of slasher movie series that became so popular that when many people think of horror, they are really only picturing slashers specifically. Comparing The Witch to, say, Jason Takes Manhattan allows for the writer of the think piece to mistakenly see a clear trajectory of so-called lesser horror to the modern art house scene. Although this ignores the fact that slasher movies can be psychological and brilliant, and it ignores the fact that these tropes of the slasher genre were challenged far earlier than the dawn of the new century, and even earlier than the postmodern deconstruction of the subgenre in Wes Craven's popular 90s horror movie Scream. In fact, a much earlier Wes Craven slasher film challenged a lot of what people have come to think of when they think about slasher movies, that being 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Yes, even only a few years into the popularization of the subgenre, the slasher movie started to both evolve and question itself. In 1992, film studies professor Carol J. Clover released Men, Women, and Chainsaws, a book that helped define the slasher genre in the popular consciousness. A Nightmare on Elm Street meets her criteria, of course, but what is more fascinating is how each criterion in the film subverts the more common usage. Let's go through this one by one. The first is the killer. Clover defines the killer as someone whose murders are often mixed up in sex or close relationships with their mother. She is mostly right, there are a lot of examples of this. Unfortunately, in this section about the killer's criteria in the book, A Nightmare on Elm Street receives only one sentence, and it's a shame because Freddy Krueger defies some of the expectations we have for slasher antagonists. He definitely meets the qualifications listed. He is a murderer and a child molester, but he deviates greatly from the other most famous villains of the subgenre. Leatherface, Jason Voorhees, and Michael Myers are all largely silent, almost animalistic killers, whereas Freddy is comical, personally vindictive, and creative. The next commonality of slasher films from the book is a terrible place, a haunted house, an isolated summer camp, etc. A Nightmare on Elm Street meets this criteria due to the dream world and specifically the image of the boiler room, but it also subverts expectations by having the vast majority of the film in a pleasant, idyllic town, a boring suburban neighborhood. The titular Elm Street gives the audience the feeling that this is actually not a terrible place, but somewhere close. Next, weapons. The book reminds us that slasher movie villains rarely use firearms despite their efficacy. This is more for visual reasons and to heighten the fear in the audience. Knives and other sharp objects feel more primal, even though, realistically, they are not as useful for a murderer. Freddy uses a claw to kill his victim, separating him from other villains with more mundane, department store weapons like butcher knives and chainsaws. Now, these are all deviations from the norm in which the subversion is aesthetic or creative. The next two slasher criteria deviations challenge the exploitative nature of the subgenre, or at least the criticism of such exploitation. Clover famously noted that sexual transgressors were most likely to die in a slasher film, and die early. This is true in A Nightmare on Elm Street, as the first victim, Tina, dies shortly after having sex with her boyfriend, Rod. Although Elm Street is a curious anomaly in the slasher subgenre because of how little it shows in terms of sex. When Rod and Tina are together, we only see Rod's back from behind. No breasts, nothing sexually graphic. It's also in a dark room. This famous scene is obviously sexually suggestive, but we never have a shot of Nancy naked. A Nightmare on Elm Street has more of a creeping, lurking sexuality. The threat of sex. Slasher movies tend to portray more women dying than men. There is an understandable discomfort in this, seeing men brutalize women, but A Nightmare on Elm Street surprisingly only shows Tina's death. Subsequent deaths are men, unless you count this mannequin. Shock. The slasher film by nature must be violent enough to shock the audience. Yep, fair enough. Last but certainly not least, the final girl. Clover claimed that in these films, the viewer began with the perspective of the killer, but audience identification shifts somewhere in the film to the final girl, in this case Nancy. The implication is that the victims are disposable and that the only notable character is the killer, in this case Freddy, until later in the film when the protagonist and antagonist face off one-on-one. While that is certainly true of many slashers, it does not seem to be true of A Nightmare on Elm Street. The characters are sympathetic. Even Rod, who comes across like a crass teenage boy in the beginning, is deeply disturbed by Tina's death and terrified that he has been falsely accused. Glenn, Nancy's boyfriend, is supportive and respectful. Nancy herself, the final girl, is clever, inventive, and strong. She defeats Freddy by no longer allowing him to frighten her, by standing up to him. She does not win by cutting off his head or drowning him in toxic waste. She wins by pure will alone. Nancy is the final girl, but she is not only the final girl. She is also the character with whom the audience identifies. The shift never happens. We always identify with Nancy as soon as we meet her, and never with Freddy. One could argue that he certainly becomes the true star of the film series in subsequent sequels, but in the original, we care about Nancy, not Freddy. The shift does not occur. It does not need to. In addition to all of this, A Nightmare on Elm Street fulfills criteria for what the aforementioned think pieces want in modern horror. It is philosophical. While the seed of the film came from a newspaper article about nightmares and death, there is another more spiritual inspiration. Wes Craven, in the excellent documentary Never Sleep Again, confirmed that Freddy Krueger preying on the children of those who killed him is biblical. A reference to the Book of Numbers, which states that God punishes not only the parents who sin, but also their children and third and fourth generations. Craven was raised in a conservative Baptist home and attended Wheaton College, a Christian liberal arts college. Although Craven later rejected the faith he was raised in, he admits that it creeps into his work. When a would-be victim sees Freddy, she prays, "Please God," to which the murderer displays his claw, naming the violence she fears as God. To sum up, horror movies have always had a spark of intelligence, and slasher movies have been subverting popular expectations and challenging themselves since the early days of the subgenre. Horror movies are going through a renaissance right now, but it's more of a renaissance of popular opinion than a renaissance of philosophical bent. The 80s and 90s had a lot of trash in the genre, but this new era does too. It has always been this way, people are just now noticing. Don't misunderstand me, I am very happy that horror is getting a lot of mainstream attention and think piece articles that promote such great recent films. The more horror fans the merrier. However, it's important to supplement this newfound interest in horror among film critics with some necessary history for context, as well as an appreciation and recognition of what horror has always been. Hi everyone, if you like what I do, please click on the orange Patreon link below. That's how this show happens. It's also the only way to request an episode. Also, there are other benefits to pledging, so check it out. The information is on my Patreon page. I'll see you next week.